Bien, bonsoir à tous.
Good morning, good evening, everyone. Tonight it's going to be a bit of a special night because usually we have presentations or conferences, and tonight we'll have a discussion. It's not a conference about an approach. There's no presentation of a specific project unless maybe we get a few slides with some projects. Tonight we're going to talk about a book. It's not that the book is coming out now, but it's a book or an essay called Four Walls and a Roof, published by Harvard University Press Harvard University Press 2 years ago almost. And the text deserves that we go beyond what we've done till now, because the subtitle is the complex nature of a simple profession. So we have here the author who's going to tell us about his rhetorics. When you look at the cover page, it's a kind of statement per se about the non-design. The cover page is a house made of recycled concrete taken in Pusterwitz in Germany. So the pictures we will see tonight are pictures taken from this book of images, in a way, dedicated to destructions. Obviously, the ghost of Charles Jenks appears right away. As you may remember, he said that modern architecture died in St. Louis on 15th of July, 1977. Let's start at 3:32. Let's start with Reinier de Graaf. He's an architect, partner in OMA, and he says that he wants to tell us about politics, the summer of 1989 and the fall of the Berlin Wall. The agency he started with in 1996, 23 years ago, is an agency which usually has more turnover. A lot of young architects go there and leave, but he's been there for a long time. And in 1989 and 99, he took part in the creation of AMO, which could be the mirror image of OMA, which is the think tank of the architectural agency. And AMO is interested in a lot of things, looking at production, looking at architectural production, and looking at its implications for other areas. And he is here to represent this positioning of AMO. We remember their position about the new European flag, for example, and the image that came out. Reinier de Graaf worked on many projects, like the airport of Schiphol in Amsterdam, also in Rotterdam, a whole project on mixity, which was considered very interesting, with the confrontation with Villaretz, and more recently with Timmerhuis, which is the extension of the building of the municipality of Rotterdam, with mixed housing, and more recently the two towers of Norra Tornen in Stockholm, which is like using brutalism for a luxury operation, and there's something quite interesting to be underscored there. He also took part in the biennial in 2012 in Venice, and he talked about the main years of the GLC in London, as well as what happened in France as well, with the importance of public commitment and public commissioning, with a lot of architects that were not as well known as the stars we're now used to. I would like to thank Jean Attali for accepting to be part in this discussion. I would like to remind you that he's a philosopher. His work is dedicated to architecture in the city. He has conceived and designed a global atlas of the cities. It's a huge work, a true research work, and as we can call it, it's a worldwide project. He teaches in the School of Paris-Malaquais, and he has a kind of story with OMA. He worked with the mutation exhibit in Arcorève. We all remember it. It was Remcolas' project, were staged by Jean Nouvel with Stéphane Aubry, and he's really followed a lot of projects of the agency. So I would like now, Reinier, to explain I would like to ask you, Jean, don't you think that this book is very wisely organized and built? Thank you very much, Francis, for this introduction. In order to facilitate the discussion with Reinier, I have thought I could speak English. Maybe from time to time I'll switch to French. And I would like to thank our interpreters who will be interpreting for you from English into French and French to English.
I would like to begin from the beginning of your book. That is the title, the subtitle, and the image on the front page. 4 walls and a roof, a sort of phenomenological epoche, that is, a reduction of our preconception and prejudices about architecture in order to get to the core or to the essence of the profession. The funny thing is that the subtitle underlines the tricky solution offered by a number of architects when they have to defend a project. So many are saying, the brief is so complex, the site is more complex yet, so there is no solution but the very simplicity of our response. I'm just joking. The image, your image, seems to be as simple as the title. The pavilion made to accommodate a family in the middle of nowhere, no context, with no architectural features, but the evidence of its strict function. The book will show that only the appearance of such a simple thing, the house is made of recycled materials coming from a previous building which was demolished. Everything in the book is intriguing, and the book leads the reader from false superficiality to true deepness of thought about everything. So my first question is, could you please, first of all, give some clues about the way you conceive the book?
Sure. Well, it's actually a bit of a funny story because I'm not sure I conceived the book in the first place. I was in the habit of writing, and I wrote columns for newspapers, for internet fora, for whatever. And I was doing that for a while. And then at a certain moment I wrote an essay about the book of Thomas Piketty, Capital in the 20th Century. And it was a relatively spontaneous essay, how I thought there were interesting parallels between his history of the economy and the history of architecture, which served to explain some of the strange changes, stylistic changes in architecture far better than any architectural historian had ever done. So I wrote that essay, published that essay. After publishing many essays, and then actually the editor of Thomas Piketty's book, who's also actually the same publisher, contacted me and said, do you want to turn that essay into a book? And I said, no. because I don't have time, and I'm not an economist, and everything I had to say on the parallels I said in the 5,000 words. C'est ça. And then I think it was a member of our PR departments, without my knowledge, who sent the other essays to the publisher. And then the publisher came up with the idea of a book of essays. And I said, well, that I could manage, because it means half the book is already done. So what the book really is, it's a collection of essays, half of which existed before the idea of a book ever came, and then the other half were written after the offer to suggest retroactively a form of coherence which otherwise may not have existed. So the structure of the book is in a way therefore extremely important, because it is a collage, and it is partly of a collage of stuff which was never written with a book in mind. So it's an accident, in other words.
Yes, but to clarify the construction, I would say that, first of all, it's difficult to keep in mind the full scope of the content of the book. My first way of reading the book was to sound it, taking here and there some samples of its ideas. Then the second way has been the reconstruction of the book as a whole. It's a 500 pages book, that is a pavé, a brick, 7 parts, 44 chapters, a number of them previously published in different newspapers, journals, architectural magazines, websites, etc., and the others, around half of all the content, have been originally edited in this book. The 7 parts make a sort of polyptych, a series of panels with a symmetrical effect, being divided by the middle. The middle makes the symmetry working, so the chapter 4, trial and error, among the 7, appears as being the central axis, as if the main entrance of the building would be set up on the geometrical center of its layout. This situation of the book reminds me one of the most important buildings made by OMA, I mean the Kunsthal. The Kunsthal in Rotterdam, which is an architectural manifesto of that kind. So I guess we are eased to begin reading the book from this point, I mean the middle of it. I remember Gilles Deleuze about the Thousand Plateaux saying that it's a book to be opened from the milieu. So my second question is, could you, I'm just insisting on this point, justify the construction or the structure of the book? I know that you used to compare the 7 chapters with the politic, the medieval polyptych. So there is a very clever construction of the whole.
Yeah, although I have to say that the comparison to the Kunsthal is new to me, and I had certainly not realized when writing, but I will use it from here on in explaining the book, I think. The number 7 has a middle, that's true. An uneven number has a middle number, and my own professional experiences are in the middle of a reflection about, on the one hand, professional experiences from the past, which precede the middle part, and then speculative essays on what the future of the profession is, so that's evident. The number 7 relates to the 7 cardinal sins or virtues from the Bible. That kind of worked, because I mean, first I realized that whatever I wrote about were roughly 7 topics. But I think the number 7 is interesting because the 7 cardinal sins and the 7 cardinal virtues are closely related. So each part of the book, for me, represents a sin or a virtue of architecture in the same way. Authority, the first part, very evident. Individual inspiration is the second part, default by design. The third part, found causes, reflects on the dual nature of good intentions. The third part, trial and error, well, reflects, I guess, on the good and bad nature of professionalism. The fifth part, powers to be, reflect on the supposed autonomy of architecture and the supposed independence from politics, which I don't think exists. The sixth part, megalopolitics, is about architecture's flirtations with scale, and especially the extremely large scale. And of course, progress reflects on progress and the question if indeed there is any. And for me, it's quite interesting that in themselves, of course, these are very laudable aspirations, but I think certain changes have taken place from the 20th to the 21st century, from before the end of history and after the end of history, which isn't quite the 20th to the 21st century, but is a moment in the late 20th century when all the ethics of modern architecture, which were forces for the good at one point, ran the risk of becoming forces for the bad other unless they seriously recalibrate themselves and have a serious amount of self-reflection. I think then architecture is in a position where it can be hugely misused for all sorts of aims which have nothing to do with its intention.
So we're coming to this point, but before I have to explain, or to invite you to explain what is your specific position with and inside the office. So what is so intriguing in your book is the absence of any reference to the OMA agenda and to the specific role you play in it. Let's say that except on the next to last chapter about the captive globe, the famous drawing, so brilliantly commented by you, Rem Koolhaas never comes, but only as the anonymous office founder, page 212. Indeed, it's a book of your own, which is willingly disconnected from the practice of OMA, despite the fact that you actually evoke your findings and your professional commitments everywhere around the world. Dubai, Russia, America, and so on. And it's funny to read at the very end of the book this notification, the names and some identifying details of certain individuals described in this book have been changed to protect their personal privacy.
Yeah, this was an American publisher. I mean, you do you do understand the repercussion of having an American publisher.
So could you tell us why and how you claim your own authorship as a writer, being still involved as one of the leading architects in the partnership of OMA? I am in no way criticizing you, but I would understand how you cast your role within the OMA network.
Yeah, I will answer. But you say that Rem Koolhaas doesn't feature in the book. He does. And there's a very specific passage where he does, which prior to answering your question I would like to read, because it's indicative, probably more indicative of the office than anything I could have written about the office per se. This is on February 9th, 2012. I am arrested at the Russian border because there is something wrong with my visa. I have a new passport. The visa hasn't been transplanted properly. I try to enter Russia. I am prevented, put in a room without water. The door is locked, and I'm told to wait and wait and wait and wait. I have some battery left on my cell phone, and I decide to call in the help of the Dutch embassy. Page 234. Before my battery definitively runs out, I decide to call the Dutch embassy. Hello? Hello. Who's this? I state my name and the name of my company and report my problem. I am passed through. Hello? Hello. Who's this? I state my name and the name of my company and report my problem. Ah. Silence. You are here on business? Yes. With a Russian firm? Yes. Perhaps it's better if you contact them. They can generally do a lot more for people than we can, even if it concerns Dutch nationals. I'm sorry to say this, but that is the way it is. Ah. Silence. Did you say Koolhaas? I haven't. If you speak to him, could you please convey that the Dutch embassy would be delighted to include him as part of our Friday afternoon drinks whenever he is in Moscow next? That would be a great honor for us. I hang up. So that is my position in the office. I wrote the book under personal title, very intentionally so. And of course, the office is all over the book. I've been in the employed first and later working as a partner and a co-owner of the office since January 1996. That is 23 years. It's nearly a quarter of a century. So to some extent, I am the office, and the office is me. I mean, everything I think about architecture is pervaded by the mentality of the office. I had 6 years of architectural education. I had a quarter of a century of OMA, so that gives you an indication of the balance. Nevertheless, one of the most interesting things about the office is, you're probably familiar with the Gertrude Stein quote that says, when you go there, you find that there is no there. I had all sorts of ideas about the position of the office prior to coming to the office, only to find out that as soon as I entered the office, all of that became a sort of a sort of chaos, a sort of deeply disorienting pool of anything from which one took as much as which one gave. So I cannot speak on behalf of the office simply because I honestly don't know what the position of the office is on many things. All I know is that there is a particular mentality which I know to be OMA. But of course while it is possible to voice a position, it is impossible to verbalize a mentality. And I think my whole book oozes OMA's mentality, which is a healthy mix of curiosity and skepsis and a fundamental ambivalence about anything, about the good in the end. And hence, the pivotal moment of the 7 sins and 7 virtues from the Bible, and how with 1 degree of temperature change one can turn into the other. I think that is ultimately what our office is about. But I would hesitate to say this on behalf of OMA in any official capacity, because I think the office is precisely so strong, because in many ways it has never set its position in stone. It has always implied its position. It's never made its position, because once it would make its position explicit, I think that would also mean stagnation in terms of the development. I think there is if you look at the whole oeuvre, and this I also remember very clearly from before I came, that there was an element of surprise to almost every next project. And I think if we were to have a mission statement like Cisco or Siemens or any of the major, I don't think we're even a brand, or any of the major brands, it would cease to it would cease to function. It was quite interesting. One of the peer reviewers signaled the same thing as you. He said the studio is the big void that in a way all the stories circle around. And if you read all of the stories, you can more or less locate the place of the void, but that is as close as you'll get. My next book will be a novel, which under the guise of anonymity might actually jump right into the void, if it ever sees the light of day.
Thanks for such an answer to this question. I think that you are endorsing this double profession of being both an architect and as a writer. And this specific situation binds you to some fundamental aspects of OMA, because making books, describing this circle around the void is really background of the agency. And I recognize in the way you are writing the book, composing it through the tone you have along your way of writing, I recognize something that you share with the founder of the office. Let's come to the content of some chapters. I'm struck by the typical quality of your argumentation. You seem to like paradoxes. Deleuze again used to say that the paradox keeps yourself close to the contradiction, but without letting you falling in it. So reasoning in this paradoxical way produces a thought attracted by the play between opposite perspectives, but it turns out the contradiction into a simple polarity. Polarity is not exclusive as the contradiction. It is an axis and a momentum between two endpoints. There is a range of such arguments in your book. This point lets me figure out one of the most intriguing qualities of your writing. I mean the tone or the mood of being constantly balancing or unbalancing between exhilaration and disenchantment. Could you develop a little about this moving tone of your feelings and statements, especially along the diary you made during your journeys in the Middle East, in Russia, or even in Europe?
About the tone, you mean, or the?
About the tone.
Yeah. Well, the diary is different from the articles because the articles are bursts of energy, either irritation or enthusiasm. There's again the balance, and I think both can be very potent sources of inspiration for writing. Loving or hating, I mean, they're equally powerful. But of course, a diary is a very different thing. A diary is, the tone of the diary is also different than the rest. It is less polished, because I'm not looking to be right, or I'm not looking for people, or to persuade people, I'm just reflecting. And the tone of the diary is a sort of pondering. It's trying to sit down. I never kept a diary. The diary was written when the book was written. So all I had was my Outlook calendar. And then the writing is a way of remembering, and then memories triggering memories, triggering memories, triggering memories, triggering memories. And that is the specific tone of the writing. It's void of any opinions, simply because all energy is consumed by digging in the memory and trying to be as precise as possible as what happened at the time. And that creates a certain dryness, which the editor also picked up on and then crossed out many adjectives to make it even more dry. But it's a diary almost written without, I think, without adverbs and adjectives, as a result partially of what it is, but also as a result of the editing.
Yes, but the editing is perfect because you write in a very live English. It's a very, very that makes the experience of reading the book a very alive one, you know. And so I'm feeling the way you are moving from enthusiasm to despair, for instance. And we understand the different situations you relate to when you have to persuade a client, when you have to face big difficulties, where we are to face the disappointment in certain situations. I would like to translate some short excerpts from your book, just to introduce through French language some of the topics you develop. The first one is about the financial crisis of 2008 and afterward. It's the 20th text, Facing the Facts. I read. La réhabilitation de l'urbanisme en tant que l'autre produit du boom de la construction est restée largement inaperçue. Les architectes ont été bien heureux d'abandonner le domaine de l'urban planning aux grands bureaux d'ingénierie, avec pour résultat ce fait que n'existe ni de bonnes pratiques, ni de théorie en ce qui concerne la plus grande part des plans urbains de ces 10 dernières années. En tant qu'agence, nous avons été à la fois les
As an office, we have been both witness and participant in this silent revolution.
Nous avons connu de très près l'expérience qui consiste
We
à
have
imaginer.
At close range, we experience cities imagining and conceiving and drafting futures of a boldness not seen since the days of Le Corbusier. In 2007, a substantial part of our office's revenue was generated by commissions for the design of large urban master plans. The 2008 crisis caused many of these planning operations to be suspended, put on hold for undefined periods of time, stuck between premature abortions and anticipated restarts. What remains is a body of work primarily known through its imagery. Visions of the future planned in a time of immense demand and market prosperity. Even if the pre-crisis boom was propelled exclusively by the forces of the market, it allowed, for the first time in 50 years, a strange and unexpected peek into a new and uncompromised modernity. The sheer scale of many of the operations provides extraordinary snapshots of how certain contemporary architects think entire cities ought to be built. The city has been turned into an imaginary universe in which ideas and ideals are taken to their ultimate conclusion, executed without contradiction. In this sense, it is through the imagery of unrealized urban visions and not through the built architectural icons that the real significance of the past decade is most clearly revealed. What will be next? The current moment is mainly one of questions. Will the pre-crisis boom go into the history books as an aberration? Or will it prove only a precursor of things to come? Is the term "on hold" applied to so many enterprises merely a convenient euphemism, to keep hope alive, a shared inability to face the facts, for clients and architects alike? Or does it signify only the pause it seems to insist on, a comma from which one day these enterprises will awaken?
So my question is, the main illusion about urban planning and design would be an urban prospect devoid of any social contradiction, won't it? And devoid of conflict. I mean, you are figure out this capacity of devoiding from the contradiction the vision of the future, and you are recalling us to the reality of the contradictions in the world.
I remember the moment the article was written. It's, I think, for an exhibition in 2011 at the British School in Rome, which was not that long after the global financial crisis. What struck me about the moment immediately before the crisis is, and this is an analogy with some of the visions drawn by the early modernists, is that the momentary suspension of all doubt is a very big factor in offering sneak previews of the future. I think the future is, if anything, the domain of imagination and possibly the domain of hallucination. And, you know, the best hallucination happen when you take substances which momentarily suspend all reservations and doubt. So the interesting thing about the period immediately prior to the crisis was that the profession as a whole seemed to be propelled into this kind of drunken state of euphoria about anything is possible. There is an abundance of money, there is et cetera, and that therefore it showed its cards. You know, just like Le Corbusier showed its cards, probably in his major utopian, very scary visions. I think Le Corbusier showed his cards in Le Plan Voisin for Paris, you know, a modern city demolishing the center of Paris, La Ville Radieuse. I mean, these endless, or even the project for New York, where New York was flattened for even bigger skyscrapers. And I think those moments of hysteria are deeply scary and dangerous, but they are also a very interesting X-ray of what I guess the marginal category of architects would do if they weren't marginal, and therefore give a very interesting insight into their true psyche, and therefore also an interesting in potential futures, as they are partly responsible for that future. And the point is, the title of that exhibition was On Hold, and that is a wonderful ambiguity too, because whenever a property developer, a promoteur, says something is on hold, that essentially means forget it. Mm-hmm. When an architect hears on hold, he sees it as an incentive, as a pause. He waits for a while, and then when the on hold is no longer there, flip, there we go again. So I find a very interesting way that you know, I'm even part of a profession, however marginal it is, that apparently needs to be kept in check every now and then.
Let me carry on this topic. I read a second passage of the book, always about urbanism and marketing. It's page 179. Jusqu'à quel point les disciplines de l'urbanisme et du marketing ont-elles fusionné? Durant les 30 dernières années, presque partout dans le monde, l'initiative en matière de construction de la ville a été transférée au secteur privé. La discipline de l'urbanisme doit maintenant donner forme à des développements, tandis que dans le même temps, Elle se trouve
To what extent have the disciplines of urbanism and marketing merged? Once urban plans were designed to accommodate the masses. Today the masses have to be seduced. If 25 years ago urban plans were still produced to cater to an actual demographic necessity, a more or less delayed response to a more or less urgent need, today urban plans are designed to attract the population they're planning for, rather than organizing and giving form to a known quantity of clearly defined uses. The task at hand becomes the accommodation of the imagined future to preempt an urban experience, while the precise substance of that experience remains undefined. The primary challenge is to be vague and explicit at the same time. The consequences of this shift have largely left the profession of urbanism in limbo. It is as though the ethic of thorough analysis and accurate planning has become worthless overnight. Advertising slogans and questions of marketability have taken its place. Renderings precede plans. The sale of land precedes the planning of infrastructure. The image precedes the substance. For every engineer, there are 100 salesmen.
Yes.
So my question is, 12 years later, is the diagnosis the same?
Well, yes, because essentially this is the fundamental contradiction that exists these days. And I think the line is in the following: the discipline of urbanism must give shape to developments, while at the same time it's entirely at the mercy of the market to make these things happen. Whereas in the 1950, when you did an urban plan, you could do that commissioned by the state, who, based on a certain analysis of income and demographics, told you to plan X, Y, and Z in response to X, Y, and Z demands. The market economy has made urbanism a form of entrepreneurship, an entreprise. Urbanism must now attract the populations that it plans. So it's a form of permanent wishful thinking. And in attracting the populations for which it plans, it is in a permanent global competition with other places who do exactly the same. And that, I think, is particularly in relation to the previous part you read, I think is an interesting phenomenon, because perhaps these extreme utopias also try to do that. By taking their dreams to the ultimate extreme, they scream loudest in order to attract the largest populations. The image now is no longer a translation of a reality. The image precedes a reality and in a way becomes an advertisement device. And the two are very, very, very closely linked. And that is the state of the architectural profession in the context of the market economy, whether we like it or not. And as long as the market economy, crisis or no crisis, the market economy is the global system. And what's more, and it's probably more so now than it was then, because in 20 years ago, 30 years ago, everybody thought that the market economy and electoral democracy were closely linked. What we see in the current world is that there are countries where you have no elections, or where you have elections where you know the outcome in advance, which is increasing. Actually, other countries which in many ways outperform the electoral democracies in being economically efficient. So in that sense, the systems don't agree on anything, but they do agree on one thing, then that is the market economy, whereby it becomes a self-perpetuating thing in itself, almost irrespective of a political system. So I think what I write here is as true today as it was then.
So what I like a lot in your book, that the clarity of the diagnosis doesn't make obstacle to your own vision of the things. I mean that if the architectural profession is in some way disturbed, if not corrupted, by this heavy importance of the market, even if you are arguing that the opposition between the political regimes don't make the difference anymore in terms of making the city. You keep yourself at a distance from this situation because you are expressing doubts. You are not expressing certitude. Mm. And in the tone of the book, it's so important to have the feeling of this, where you are doubting in front of your commitments in architecture and urbanism.
Yeah, but I think that is a very important thing. I mean, I think our profession doubts way too little. Well, our profession probably doubts a lot. Mm. I'm pretty sure many people doubt, but it's a very, very big taboo to doubt publicly. Mm-hmm. I sometimes have the feeling that the more one doubts internally, the less one doubts publicly. And there are very few books about architecture by architects that are honest. I mean, most of them are sort of promotional books on their own buildings and the almost heroic efforts that they overcame in achieving a building against the odds. I mean, they're like Charles Bronson in their own film. I thought it was important to speak about failure. Because sometimes in the operations that fail, there is more wisdom than in the operations that succeed. Because by definition, they force you to think. And I think to gain knowledge from almost any operations, including the ones that fail, is a very, very fundamental part of architecture, and also a very, very fundamental part if architecture wants to survive and progress. I mean, I think it's quite simple. I mean, the solution to any problem starts with the frank acknowledgement that there is a problem. And in a way, that's what the book does, and that's why the book is so dry and so dispassionate at times, because it's very phenomenological, or do you call it that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think that your sincerity in front of this kind of issues about doubt or no doubt makes you really a writer. And the distance, the main distance from your role as an architect and your role as a writer is there. In this capacity of being sincere and to express the doubt about the different situations you are involved to.
Yeah, I think that's interesting because, I mean, I do think that there is a sincerity in architectural design too. There is a sincerity in writing, and there is a sincerity in architectural design. There is just very little sincerity in talking about architectural design. It's actually when you try to bridge the two types of sincerities, that's an incredibly difficult thing.
I'm sure.
Yeah.
So let's come to the question of creativity, both in architecture and in writing. I read the passage named Creativity, page 71, in the chapter The Inevitable Box. Est-ce que l'on peut construire une œuvre à partir d'une seule bonne idée?
Can a body of work be built on the basis of one good idea? If so, what makes such an idea? Is the measure of a good idea how much it renders further ideas unnecessary? When something good is invented, what reason can there be against applying it until something better comes along? Once the ideal paradigm is established, we repeat it. Everything unfolds from there. Further choices are self-evident. There are many ideas. There are few good ideas. Good ideas occur infrequently. Technology, the media, and the internet do nothing to change that. Sometimes centuries pass before the next good idea presents itself. Entire generations are forgotten by history because they didn't have a good idea. If architecture is both the consequence and the expression of technological breakthroughs, one wonders which technological breakthroughs shape architecture today. The information revolution, the revolution of our time, doesn't change buildings. It changes the way we use them. Its effects on architecture are limited in allowing us to be productive regardless of circumstances or locations. It even reduces the demand for buildings. We do whatever, wherever, whenever. Anything can happen in any space. By further disengaging buildings from what goes on inside them, the digital, more about that later, makes architecture less important, not more. Architecture promotes itself as a creative discipline. Insofar as creativity is predicated on the new, on invention, it is different from logic, which is predicated on deduction. Sometimes creativity and logic meet in perfect sync. More often, they clash. The love affair between creativity and logic is at best turbulent, of limited importance for the majority of architectural production. Ever since industrial production began, architecture has followed an ethos of repetition and reduction. Creativity occurs in the margins, if at all.
Are you thinking that you are working in the margins?
This particular essay is par excellence a mood piece. This is, despite its robust, bold, and very macho claims, the part of the whole book where it approaches literature most, in the sense that I sort of method act a man, somebody like myself. Sorry. I try to method act a man, somebody who is a lot like myself, who spontaneously falls in love with the box, and who's fascinated by the box because it is both the outcome of the most extreme attempt at architecture and the outcome of no attempt at architecture at all. And Mies van der Rohe and the average petrol station are not very, very far apart. So from that realization, I wrote this essay in a specific mindset, where also artificially in my head, I got worked up. I wrote this over Christmas. And it started with one paragraph, became two, became more. And at a certain moment, everything was the box. It was a bit like Baudrillard after he discovered the phenomena of simulation and only saw simulation wherever he looked. So it's also a kind of an almost ironic piece, how a theory can get out of hand, even though I do think it promotes a lot of things that are true. I mean, the box is everywhere, and creativity is in the margins. So again, it's an ambivalence of being ubiquitous and being in the margins at the same time, of being all relevant and being irrelevant. I mean, and that is something, this is my own favorite essay, merely because it didn't involve any research It just was a kind of mental digging in the darker parts of my brain when it comes to architecture.
But it expresses your personal preoccupation, because you used to work as a pioneer defending a certain definition of the role of an architect everywhere around the world. So something is just facing the economic, political situation where you meet your clients, and when you try to match to the requirements of the commissions, and somehow you are resisting this professional, regular occupation to maintain the ambition of this creativity, this marginal creativity, but with a high potential.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, the line you read in the middle, which in English reads, sometimes centuries pass before the next good idea presents itself. Entire generations are forgotten by history because they didn't have a good idea. Mm. That could be our generation. And that was the mentality from which this was written. And maybe not, but we won't know until we're dead.
Hopefully not.
Yeah.
Hopefully
but
not.
We won't know.
Yeah.
And the point is that no generation in its own time knows. But yeah, so that's the box.
Francis?
Yes, on page 323, you're talking about architecture as a negotiated art, and it's highly political, you say.
Did I say that?
Yes, you said that. So my question is, to what...
I didn't say that. This is
That was a quote.
It's a benevolent dictator with taste.
Okay.
That's
yes,
an article entirely made up of quotes.
Anyway, what do you think about the art of negotiation? Because to what extent does the negotiation... We're talking about urbanisme négocié in France. Yeah. Do you feel at ease with that kind of negotiation?
No, not at all. I like negotiation in every field, but not in architecture. And I think it is the job of the architecture to negotiate so well in all other fields that he doesn't have to negotiate architecture. And that architecture almost, if it happens in the margins, you yourself decide the size of those margins by how well you negotiate everything else, which I also think is a compelling reason to be interested in context of architecture, and also to be interested in the financial context of architecture in particular, because that, in the market economy, determines the space in which you operate. Not your idealism, but your hardcore realism on facts like that. Who is the quote by the way? I'm looking. I can't remember, because the whole point of the essay of quotes is that they all blend, and that it sounds like one architect who talks himself into trouble. So yeah, but that's my position. I think architecture is not necessarily a negotiated art, but it's an art of negotiating everything else so that you don't have to negotiate architecture.
Okay, Jean Attali picked, the situation about the merging of urbanism and marketing, and my question is, what is the strategy of OMA about how do you cope with this marketing?
Well, I think we cope with it quite fine. I mean, we're generally...
Yes, I guess so.
I mean, one of the essential things of our practice, and I think that's also present in the book, that we have an ability to love what we hate. And that there is a kind of Freudian flight forward possible, where fascination and disgust are eerily close together, where you can look at a phenomena at a gaze with a kind of total revulsion, and then the next thing, if that's possible, then that's possible, and I can turn it. There's this beautiful quote from Rem very early on, where he talks about surfers on the waves, who in a way presents architects as those who ride the currents of the world. And sometimes, just sometimes, they have the ability to use the force of the waves to go against the waves. So that, I think, is what architects do. But first you have to be aware of the forces of the waves to be able to do that. So that is the same with marketing. It is a trend that is undeniably there. It is the quintessence. Anything is marketing in this day and age. In the age of the internet, in the age of the market economy, there is hardly any more objectivity. Anything has an ulterior motive. There's no news and fake news. I mean, and in that sense, that is a reality that once you study it long enough, you can also do something with and turn it against itself. So I think in particular contexts, we've essentially also deliberately used it to be able to do what we want.
I have another question about what I call the no design approach in your book. I mean in the editorial field. We all remember the SLMXL, a book with Bruce Mau, or the content in a book in 2004. My question is: are you exploring another way of, presenting ideas not related with image? Because you were talking about the power of image, but it's really amazing that you make not any link with any projects that could support your ideas or your.
Yeah, but I wanted to write a book, and
yes.
And books are written. And plus, I was only allowed 70 black and white images by the publisher. I've deliberately used a font. I don't know what font it is, but it's a serif font, which is generally used for books which are meant to be read. My book is meant to be read. I mean, there is in the world of architecture so many, books of biblical proportions with an almost negligible word count. And it's also a way of going against the grain in a culture where fewer people read, where people say the book is on the way out. I thought it was an interesting way of going against the grain by embracing this sort of moribund art form of writing. So it's, I'm very, and I'm also nostalgic. And so I nostalgically write about times which I think were less nostalgic than the present. And there's our office produces so many images, produces so many books, produces so many visual noise that I thought this would be a nice antidote.
Antidote. Oh. Okay, now we can catch some questions in the audience.
Can I ask a question in English?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, my name is Peter. I'm actually Russian, but that's why I ask in English. I actually appreciated your reflection on the influence on market economy, on urbanism, and on city management, especially. And my question would be, well, actually I found that it was some similarities, some inspiration maybe from the Antonio Negri and Michael Hart's book. I don't know if there was one, but... And so my question would be, do you think this expansion of market economy and the way it takes a lot from public activities and from public way of doing architecture influences in a bad way in architecture? And before you say that it does, do you think there is a way back? To these nostalgic times, and if there is way back, would it be good for architecture?
Well, the book you referred to is, I think, called No More Outside.
No, it's Empire.
Okay, Empire. The whole point is what I think we are witnessing is that the globalization of the economy has progressed and gone much faster than the internationalization of politics, which means that the playing field of the economy is always larger than the playing field of politics, which also means that in a pre-globalized world, the economy was a subsector of the political, we're currently seeing the other way around, that the political is the subsector of the economy, and I think architecture and almost any profession is profoundly affected by that, and often profoundly affected by that, not necessarily in a good way. But it would be very unfair and unrealistic to ask those professions to come up with a solution in the face of that, when the solution to that ultimately is political. And unless this is going to carry on for a while, and this is going to be like this for a while, and we'll probably have to produce buildings, master plans, etc. in this context for a while, which is not to say that it's the ideal system per se. It's also not to say that it's the last system, but real change has to come from a kind of political recalibration, I feel, and until that happens, this is as good as it gets.
My name is Melchior. I was in Russia during 1 year at Moscow Architectural Institute, and I have visited the Skolkovo project, like this big master plan, and there is lots of failure architecture, especially Matryoshka building. But my question is more about...
I've very carefully tried to anonymize everything in the book, so thanks for lifting that.
But my question is more about how are you going to negotiate, especially about creation and artistical things, about the transformation of Tretyakov Galleria made by your company?
I think it is very early to answer that question. The whole project is in an incredibly early stage, and we'll see what comes. But I would also, in relation to the book, in fairness, I would also like to refrain from commenting on specific OMA projects. Specifically OMA project, I mean, we are a big firm. We are owned by 9 people, 9 minority shareholders who all have our projects, who all have our domain. I am not working on the Tretyakov Gallery at present, so any far-ass answer I might give you will be the product of ignorance. I am happy to answer, in a way, questions about projects I specifically have run as an architect, but I'm very hesitant to kind of be the spokesperson of operations I'm not responsible for. I can talk about Skolkovo quite a lot. On Tretyakov, I'm not running that project. So sorry.
Be careful on the project, because Herzogenaurach project on Skolkovo was like cut in 2 parts. Mm-hmm. And was...
Yeah, well, I mean, so they got out 50% better than we, because we were cut away.
Yeah.
I don't know what's better, by the way, to be cut in half or to stay away and avoid cutting. I mean, that is maybe the underlying question there. I mean, I don't know how much caution per se is a good element to architecture. I mean, it's quite interesting that we suffer a fair amount of criticism about the projects we accept, about the places in which we work, etc. Nevertheless, I'm always kind of proud that we get our hands dirty every now and then, that we engage in contexts where success isn't a given at the outset. And I have to say, by now that accounts almost for all contexts. But I think every project has to be assessed on its own merits. There are good projects in bad parts of the world. There are bad projects in supposedly good parts of the world. And once you would become very categorical in your caution vis-a-vis particular parts of the world, I think then you also run the risk of simply repeating prevalent moralistic stances about which part of the world. We on Monday mornings, we assess which projects we do, and it's always a very interesting, convoluted, kind of strange, inconsequential discussion. But it is a discussion per project, and that is very, very interesting. So we accept projects in Russia, knowing the way Russia's heading. We reject projects in America, knowing the way America is heading. But once you would be like, you know, you would follow sanction lines, would follow boycott lines, you very quickly then also become the subsector of one political system when the world actually is and ought to be made up of more. So thanks for the advice. We will be very, very careful with Tretyakov. We will not be cut in half, hopefully, but we will put our heart and soul in it until the burden of proof that we should not becomes too dominant.
Hello, I'm quite intrigued by what you said about negotiation. You said you can negotiate everything but not architecture. So how do you manage not to negotiate architecture once you have negotiated all the rest? No, it's really a very practical question.
Yeah. No. I said should. Okay. And can and should are two very different verbs. You probably know the difference. I think it should be the aim to negotiate everything else as good as possible, so that you have to negotiate as little as possible on architecture. It's very clear. Any building you build, any building you realize, is a percentage of what you intended. Sometimes it's less than 50, sometimes it's more than 50. Let's say that the measure of success is somewhere around 65%. Although it's hard to measure. It's quite. When I look at our own buildings, and I got this question a lot about comparing our own buildings to other people's buildings. I almost never do, and I was quite taken aback by the question, simply because I didn't know the answer. It's simply because we never do. Because what you invariably do as an architect is compare the building that got built to the building that was on the drawing board before it got built. So of course, one negotiates architecture too, but I think the point is that you should negotiate architecture as little as possible and therefore negotiate everything else as much as possible, simply because architecture is our complexly simple profession. So that the complex nature of a simple profession, the subtitle also relates to that. Simplicity might be the aim of a lot of architecture, but it's hugely complex to get to the point of simplicity.
Thank you. And besides, the subtitle is what I really love in your book. So thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Okay, so that is the perfect transition to my question, because it was about the subtitle. I'm very intrigued. I just discovered the book, but I'm very intrigued by the subtitle, which says the complex nature of a simple profession. My first question is, do you think that is now a simple profession? And what do you think about the fact that the profession is getting more and more simple in education? It used to be more complex to be an architect before. And the simplification of the professions leads to maybe more complexity of actually doing it. And I don't know. You were during your talk. You were talking about paradoxes, and I think
Jean-Bas, I think, but
yeah,
not me.
No, and contradictions. And I think there is maybe one in the evolution of our profession. What do you think about that?
Well, when I write the complex nature of a simple profession, it's very obvious that with that subtitle, it's not a simple profession. I think that's fairly evident. The other thing is you must distinguish between simple and simplistic. And I think that's the difference you're getting at. I mean, simple is, well, the beauty of simplicity. Simplistic is unnecessarily reductivist and ignoring many things that might be important to the profession. I don't know, to be honest, whether architectural education is getting more simple or more complex than it used to be. It's a long, long time ago that I had an architectural education. And it had its fair amount of simplisticness as far as I can remember then. So I'm sure that the same balancing act that was prevalent when I studied is still prevalent today. I teach in a number of schools. And there I certainly don't get the impression of simplisticness, and if anything, also try to invent assignments which cut off that route pretty quickly, which I think if there's enough people doing that, it also challenges education.
By simplification, I was more talking about the separation between architecture, like design, and the scientific knowledge that the engineers are more knowledgeable about today.
Yeah, although I don't recall that was all that different when I studied. I mean, engineering. I studied at a technical university where architecture was even a completely separate faculty from civil engineering, physics, etc., and all of the material research, etc., and all of these things that affected architecture. So the separation, I think, has existed for some time. What actually makes architecture interesting for me is not necessarily that it should compete with the specialism of engineering or any other type of technical knowledge. What I think makes architecture often quite interesting is the fact that it's not a specialism, but that it's an integrator, and that therefore it can sort of helicopter hover above all of these myopic specialisms, which know a lot about very little. Architecture is, by definition, knowing a little about a lot. And that is a disjunction which, strangely, if you talk about the negotiation position of an architect, its ignorance on a lot of technical stuff is sometimes a key card, because the people they negotiate with, property developers, politicians, are wonderfully ignorant in their own right. So the language of technical ignorance is the synchronicity in which clients and architects talk, and in which they enjoy a strange sort of recognition and confidence on the part of clients. So I don't know.
Hello. First, I would like to say that I think in France we have this very deep contradiction of love and hate towards the OMA office. And
which side are you on?
Sorry?
Which side are you on? So just that I can prepare.
I'm really in between. But, so sorry. And I would like to come back to this idea of images and illusions of the city, and to the problem of the confrontation of the architect towards the reality of the situations of cities. Because as a student, I feel like I have been formed to build these images. So do you think that the OMA office, by being fascinating and hating the marketing system of building cities, really finds an answer, really propose a solution?
Well, I mean, there's about 5 misguided assumptions already in your question, which I guess sort of convinces me what side to put you on. And by the way, as OMA, we have a wonderful, or I personally have a wonderful love-hate relationship to France. So we meet in sync, I guess. I never said that we hate the market economy. I said something quite different. I think we resign to the fact that the architect isn't a heroic, omnipotent figure, and that therefore architects will not be the ones to change the market economy. The architect uses the market, and that's the core end of creativity, is making the most of something, and that therefore what we do is study the market economy, analyze it, and use its force to somehow go with it, and more often go against it. But that is, I mean, if you hate something, you hate something, and then you're not a sailboat or a surfer on the waves, then you're a kind of, I guess, emergency vessel going against the wave and drowning pretty soon. So that is the difference.
Okay.
Does that answer your question? No.
I think it didn't, but okay. I think I know where to place you towards this answer.
Okay.
Yeah. So.
Should we have a drink or?
Good evening. A very simple question. The complex nature of a simple profession, 4 walls and a roof, and what about the slab? Maybe it's a simple question, but it raises complex thoughts maybe because it's the most related element of a house, for example, that goes with nature and maybe with the Anthropocene. And I didn't read the book yet, but is it something that you talk about? Or?
Well, there's plenty of slabs in the book. 4 walls and a roof. The title comes from somebody. I think it actually was one of my first girlfriends who was not an architect and who wondered why I was going on about it all the time and the time and the time and the time and the time. And who basically very provocatively asked, but what did you study for so long? Isn't architecture just 4 walls and a roof? And I was deeply shocked and insulted and hurt and blah, blah, blah at that age. Until I discovered that that is somehow the prevailing perception of the rest of the world. So the point of the title is to embrace a prevailing perception and do something with it. And I have not discovered that the slab, although very important to architects, is yet part of the prevailing perception of architecture. But that is the point of the title.
Thank you. Why did you become an architect?
Because it seemed an inspiring and enjoyable, worthwhile profession to me. And it still is.